Misfits, and welcome. In today's video, we are talking about how to create character arcs for your player characters. So I'm talking, how do you sort of introduce these different story components to help these characters develop and progress and become these famous heroes by the end of the story. This video in particular is really going to be geared towards people that like to run story-driven or role-play-heavy games. Also, this video is going to piggyback off of my campaign creation video as well as my how to create a backstory video. Those two videos were pretty broad, and intentionally so. So in this video, we're kind of diving into some more specifics that will hopefully help you have some better tools in your belt when you're creating campaigns and helping your players flesh out their backstories. And of course, this is just what I do. This is sort of my personal practices. It doesn't have to be what you do. There might be some things in here that you don't like or you don't agree with, and that's totally fine. Take from it what you will, what you think is helpful to you, and ignore the rest. But with all of that out of the way, let's get into it. Before I start naming bullet points, I do want to say that this is a hard topic to kind of put in a neat little list for you guys. I've given it a ton of thought, and I've talked over all of these points pretty thoroughly with one of my great friends, Sarah, who is an English teacher and a writer. So this list does come from research and practice, not just thin air. So first, when you're creating a meaningful character arc for your player characters, you first need to know where these characters start out. And when I say you need to know where they start out, I mean you need to know where they physically and mentally begin the story. Where are they? Where do they come from? What are they thinking? What's their headspace as they begin this adventure? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? And this is where that character backstory how-to video might come into play. Give you a rough idea of where to start with that. But basically, this is the time when you as the DM need to sit down with your players and discuss their backstories and figure out what all these characters have experienced so that you have a better understanding of where they might be headed. And normally, I would tackle this in a session 0 or maybe a couple session 0s with my players, so I highly recommend you do the same. Having a session 0, fabulous tool. One of the most important things when you're trying to figure out where these characters start out is kind of getting a sense of what their flaws and their weaknesses are. Strengths are great, they're fantastic, but I think the flaws are the most important. Those are what make our characters a little bit more endearing. Those also provide us with the obstacles and challenges that these characters need to overcome in order to succeed and become heroes. Any great character in any movie or book or TV show is going to have some flaws. If they don't have any flaws at all, that's normally when we consider them kind of a flat or boring character, because they don't struggle with anything. Let's look at an example. Let's look at Luke Skywalker. At the very beginning of the story, we find that he is a nobody moisture farmer on the desert planet of Tatooine, and he has some strengths. We're told that he's good at flying. We see that he's good with droids. He kind of has like this sort of ambition or longing, wants to go out and be useful and do something. And he also has plenty of flaws. He's kind of whiny. He's not particularly good at fighting. He's a bit impulsive. We see plenty of things that kind of work against him. And the Luke Skywalker we're introduced to at the beginning of the story is a far cry from the one that we see at the end in Return of the Jedi. So we know that a lot of changes have to happen along the way to get to that one. But those changes can't really happen without these different flaws and things that have to be overcome. And for a little bit of contrast, let's look at an example of a character that doesn't have a lot of flaws, and that's a problem. Let's look at Rey from the sequels. We're introduced to her. She, like Luke, is sort of like this nobody on a desert planet, but she's a scavenger. And we see a lot of strengths from her pretty quickly. We see that she's really, really good at flying. We see that she's really good with tech and scavenging. We see that she's really brave. She's also really, really good at fighting. She kind of just like takes to everything naturally. She's got street smarts as well. We don't really see flaws. I think the only flaw that's really evident in her introduction is like maybe her curiosity, but that's kind of it. And because she doesn't have really any notable flaws, she doesn't struggle with anything. And that's why we kind of get like less interested in her character as the stories progress, because every time she's introduced to a problem or a challenge, she immediately overcomes it. Whereas Luke has to really struggle to overcome it, and when he finally does, it feels earned. It feels like it means something. So just keep that in mind. When you're trying to develop these characters, keep careful watch over what their strengths and weaknesses are so that you know how to craft things that cater to that and to those various things. Okay, once you know where these characters begin, where they start out, we need to see where they are going or where they hope to go. So this is where you need to figure out what the goal of these characters are. What is their goal? To be stronger, to be wiser, to be more reserved, to be more open? Is their goal to become king or to become the best fighter? What exactly is their goal? This is really, really important. They don't have to necessarily achieve that goal, but we need to know kind of where they want to head, so that we need to figure out what kinds of things they might hit along the way to either help them get there or keep them from getting there. You know what I mean? Luke Skywalker wants to become a Jedi Knight, but I mean, along the way he learns that maybe that's not the easiest task and it means more than what he initially thought. Anakin wants to save Padme. He wants to save his love. And he learns that that's a very difficult path, and there are going to be lots of bumps in the road along that way, and he may or may not be able to accomplish that without losing some aspect of himself. But knowing that end goal helps us sort of bridge the starting point and the end point. We have to know where they start, we have to know where they want to end up, so we can figure out what happens in between. And now let's talk about that in between. So number 3, what can we do? What can we challenge them with that might help them change or grow and potentially reach that end goal, or potentially not reach that end goal? So this is really the most important part. After knowing where they start out, this is what's important. After you know what those character flaws are and character strengths are, you can introduce a bunch of different things to challenge them. This could be character foils, which is basically another character that is sort of the opposite or antithesis of this player character that you're crafting an arc for. In Star Wars, we have Luke, this sort of young, impressionable, always wants to do the right thing, very noble character, and his character foil is probably going to be Han Solo, this scoundrel who thinks of himself first, and he's a little bit more morally gray and greedy, and they are not very similar, at least not on paper, but as they interact, they start to change each other, and they become more similar to each other. Luke picks up some smarts and street smarts from Han and becomes a little bit more crafty, and Han becomes a little bit more selfless and honorable as the two interact. But they also clash a lot along the way, and that's really important. That's what helps those characters stop and think about their actions and think about their goals and start to question them. In my current game, I have a player who plays a rogue named Theron, and she is very isolated. She doesn't really like to share any details about herself. She really only thinks about herself and saving her own skin. She's not particularly religious, but she's starting to learn that she has these connections to the dark goddess Shar. And I also have in my party a very kind and open and pious cleric named Chi, and She worships Sulune, which is like the opposite of Shar. She is very sort of extroverted and open and wants to know everything about everybody so that she can figure out how to help them. And the two are perfect foils for each other. So, naturally, since I've been presented with such a glorious pairing, I have sort of tied their backstories together in various different ways so that they are forced to interact with each other, and they fight and argue. They also comfort each other, and those little clashes and interactions make them think about themselves and think about their beliefs and their feelings and question that. And it's helping both of those characters develop and grow over the course of my campaign. You can also introduce NPCs that can act as a foil to these player characters as well. Also in my current campaign, I have a very extroverted, boisterous, out there sort of swashbuckler, and I've introduced an NPC that is sort of reserved, keeps himself, not overly friendly, and those two are really good opposites of each other, but their interactions have caused each other to sort of change and shift, and so it's very interesting to throw in a foil, some sort of opposite that kind of makes these characters call everything of their being into question. So that's one route. You could also have instances where these characters have to confront their own fears. And that's a really useful tool for if they have like trauma that they need to work through. Confronting their fears could be super useful. And sort of to piggyback off of that, another thing you could do is have them face their temptations. In my old campaign, I had a character that his goal was to travel back in time and save his parents. And he had this sort of constant fear over losing his family. And so I would thrust this character into situations where he had to face his family that he was trying to protect and sort of face mortality. And I also gave him the ability to travel back in time to save his parents. But I saved that until the very end of the campaign. And so over the course of time, this character had, after being confronted with his fears and temptations, had seen how, despite losing his parents, life went on, and there are good things that can come from that. When he finally was faced with that decision to travel back in time, he saw what it could affect in a negative way, how it could take away some of the happiness that his family had found afterwards, and decided not to travel back in time. So there are lots of different ways that could go. I mean, facing temptation, throw your rogue into a shop full of treasure. Confronting your fears, have your character that's afraid of the dark thrown into a dark dungeon. There are lots of different ways. They can be deep, they can be surface level. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is that you are challenging them. You also need to continue to challenge them throughout the story, and a lot of these challenges can be the same thing. If you're throwing the same questions at them, the same problems at them, they won't always solve them the same way, and maybe they start the campaign solving them one way, but then at the end, they've changed their mind and they solve it a different way. That shows growth. Sometimes you have to ask somebody the same question 80 times just to figure out which answer they actually do lean towards. When we take all those personality quizzes, like Myers-Briggs, they ask you the same question over and over and over again, but worded slightly differently to gauge how you actually lean, whether you lean one way or another. So it's kind of the same thing. You might need to present them with the same problem in slightly different variations over and over again just to see which way they lean. You might constantly present characters with the opportunity to save somebody with a reward or save somebody without getting a reward. And maybe over time, they stop worrying about the reward. Or maybe over time, they become jaded and they do start worrying about the reward. But regardless, you need to continue to challenge them so that they can continue to think about these problems, these fears, these temptations, the things that they are hoping to achieve, and they call them into question. That's how we get character growth. Something else that could be important is to establish a theme that goes along with these characters. I talk about theme in my campaign creation video, but it's also very important for characters as well. It's kind of hard to determine the theme until you have figured out where those characters are starting out and what their sort of weaknesses and strengths are and what their potential goals are. So once you know all of those things, maybe you can pick a theme that goes with them. And, you know, there are lots of different themes. Some of them are more specific than others. It doesn't really matter. Some examples would be like good versus evil, or nature versus nurture. There are lots of different themes, but it's nice to pick one because it just sort of adds a little bit of cohesiveness and consistency to the story, which can be really important. So, let's review. The first thing you need to do is figure out where the characters are starting. Their strengths, their weaknesses, their headspace, just sort of what kind of material you're working with at the very start. Now, we need to see what their goals are, what they hope to achieve. Next, we figure out how to challenge them along the way. You constantly hit them with various moments where they have to confront their fears, resist their temptations, kind of be faced with people that don't think and act the same way that they do. And after all these constant things along the way, we see if they're able to accomplish their goals or if their goals have changed. So that's essentially how we're sort of structuring this character arc. Now, something that's really important to note is that you really can't write or plan all of this out ahead of time. And that's because this is a D&D campaign. It's going to change and be written as the story unfolds. Because you're not solely in charge of the story, it's a collaborative effort at your table. So, I would keep the goal in mind. I would keep some ideas in your head, but don't be married to anything in particular. A lot of times when I'm structuring stories, I have big moments that I will sort of maybe space out, with the understanding that those might be tweaked or taken away completely depending on the character actions. And I'll just sort of have this sort of very bare bones, like, skeleton of a story. And sometimes those pieces can get moved around or swapped out, but that's normally what I do when I structure a story. And then as we progress, we see what gets slotted into place as we go. I think one other thing that's important when we're talking about character arcs is we kind of have to start the story maybe with more training wheels, and by the end, we don't need them anymore. So, the beginning-ish of the story, we might have more mentor figures or people that they can rely on for help, but by the end, they are the person that people go to for help. And that can be a tricky thing to accomplish. Normally, I will think of appropriate times in which I'll throw in, like, the opportunity for them to reach out to helpful people, but then I normally try to find times to pull those characters and that help away from them so that they have to solve these problems on their own. It's kind of like the reason why most heroes don't have, like, great family situations at home, because if everything's great at home and everything's safe and people can take care of stuff for them, why would they ever leave? So if you've got those, like, mentor figures, you need to figure out how to take them out of the picture kind of early on so that your heroes can solve these problems on their own. I'm not saying you have to kill the mentor, but they kind of got to get removed, or the players have to be taken somewhere else where they're not with them. So just keep that in mind. So let's look at a character and let's follow their entire character arc. So we talked a little bit about Luke and where he starts out. Moisture farmer, has ambition, wants to do good, kind of weak, kind of whiny. That's where he starts out. And I think, like, his first goal is to help Leia. But after learning a little bit about himself, it sort of becomes this goal of becoming a Jedi. That's where he starts out. He faces many a challenge along the way. He loses his family, so he has no reason to stay home. That's why he goes adventuring. He has to deal with this Han Solo figure that's nothing like him, and they argue a lot. He loses his mentor, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and so that one, sort of crutch he was holding on to sort of help him through other situations, he doesn't have that anymore. He has to figure things out on his own. He is constantly battling, his own self. He's impulsive, and he wants to do things selfishly for his own reasons. He has all these attachments and things he cares about, and he doesn't know how to let go of that for the sake of the greater good. And so he's constantly battling himself. He has several moments on Dagobah with Yoda where he's battling his own inner self. And then, of course, he has this, family issue of, oh, my dad's evil, and he's not who I thought he was, and that's another thing that he has to deal with. And so he has to confront his father, which is also sort of the embodiment of his fears. He's afraid he'll become his father, and he has these temptations of facing the dark side. But ultimately, he does become a Jedi Knight, and he's able to bring balance to the Force and save the galaxy and all of that stuff. So, we see where he starts, we see what his goals are, how they kind of shift a little bit, because I would say, maybe becoming a Jedi was part of it, but eventually it sort of turns into this, we have to save the galaxy, and then I need to save my father. His goals shift as the story progresses, and they shift because of all of those things that happen along the way. Let's look at Frodo. He starts out, little nobody hobbit in the Shire, and he really wants adventure. He is curious. He's pretty brave, I would say, but he's also naive, and he kind of has this sort of greed component to him because of the ring he carries. He's sort of possessive of that, and it's not really his fault, but that's how it is. So he has these various strengths and weaknesses, and his goal at first is to just take the ring to Rivendell. He faces all of these different challenges along the way. There are the Wraiths that want to take the ring from him. There are his friends that might not fully understand the gravity of the situation at first. There's just being generally afraid of just leaving home and being away from his comforts. And there's this constant temptation of putting on the ring. His goals shift as he faces all of those things. It's not just taking the ring to Rivendell anymore. Now we have to take it to Mordor. And now we don't get to take it to Mordor with our friends, but we have to take it to Mordor by ourselves because our friends can't help us. Boromir falls to temptation. He gets separated from, his pals, and it's just him and Sam, and then eventually Sméagol. And Sméagol is a great foil for Frodo. He's everything that Frodo could become. And so it's this struggle of trying to prevent himself from becoming that. And by the end, his goal is always to take the ring to Mordor. That doesn't change, but his ability to accomplish that on his own, or his ability to accomplish that of his own will is called into question. He's not super able to do that because this ring temptation is so strong. Alright, so we've talked through everything. I've given you some examples. I really hope that gives you a better idea of how to structure a nice character arc. It's not the easiest thing to do, and it's especially difficult in a campaign because a lot of this hinges on your players taking the bait. If you're writing a book, you can tell the characters what they do, and you tell them how they answer these problems. Your players will not answer these questions and face these problems the way you intend them to. I guarantee you 9 times out of 10, your players are going to do things different from what you expect. And you kind of have to roll with that. If you see them starting to lean a certain way and sort of approach a certain end point, then you need to focus in on that and be attuned to what their goals are and how you can help them get there. It's your job as the DM to kind of steer them in the directions you want to, but if they fight you on it, then you need to change course and you need to adjust things to suit what your players want. Because it's their character, it's not yours. Alright, so gosh, I feel like this was such a frazzled video, so I hope it comes out in the edit far more organized than it feels in my brain. But if you enjoyed this video and you found it useful, please feel free to like and subscribe, but most importantly, leave me a comment below. Tell me about some crazy character arcs or character moments that happened at your table. Tell me what you do as a DM to craft an arc for your player characters. Or if you're a brand new DM and you still have questions, type your questions down below in the comments and I'll read them and do my best to answer them. Basically, I just want to help you guys out in whatever way I can. So, yeah, talk to me down below. But with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and I will see you again next time. Apologies for kind of dogging on the Star Wars sequels. I am a staunch original trilogy fan, and I didn't like the sequels. And you know, when you sit down and you sort of pick apart that story and see how it doesn't really fit the sort of literary structure of a general like arc for a character, it kind of makes sense why, in my opinion, it doesn't work super well. The original trilogy literally is the textbook example for the journey of the archetypal hero, for all you like literature nerds out there, and I love it so much. I mean, literally that's how archetypes and symbolism were taught to me when I was in school. Was my teacher used Star Wars, which was awesome. Yeah, and those new sequels, they don't hit right. They make me quite frustrated. But I don't know. Maybe better things are on the horizon. I'm a little burned out on Star Wars and Marvel as well. They need to shelve all of that for a little while, I think, and just sort of let us have time to miss it, so that when it comes back, we're excited for it, instead of just like shoving it all in our faces all the time. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. If you're burned out on some of that stuff, tell me about it, because I would love to know that I'm not alone. Anyway, have a great day, guys. Bye.